Hello, my name is Tamsin Peach and welcome to another episode of History Lab Live, where we bring you recordings of conversations about Australian history happening in bookshops, universities and public venues across the country. In 1960, one of the most famous voices in the world arrived in Australia. Paul Robeson was a singer with a voice that could fill concert halls, but he was also a lawyer, an actor, an athlete, and one of the most outspoken civil rights activists of the 20th century. Alongside him was his wife, Eslanda Robeson, an anthropologist, United Nations journalist, and political organiser in her own right. Their visit to Australia and New Zealand came after nearly a decade of enforced silence. During the Cold War, the United States government had stripped Paul Robeson of his passport, effectively grounding one of the world's most influential black internationalists. When the Robesons finally arrived, their tour became something much more than a series of concerts. In this episode of History Lab Live, brought to you in partnership with Glee Books, historian Anne Curthoys joins journalist and academic Lorena Allam to talk about what happened when Paul and Eslanda Robeson came to Australia in 1960 and why their visit helped energise new forms of First Nations protest, cultural exchange and international thinking. This conversation was recorded in July 2025.
Yama, everybody. I'm Lorena Allam, and I'm delighted to be here in conversation with Anne Curthoys and to talk about your new book, The Last Tour. I'm delighted because of your major contribution to Australian history and also from my family who come from those towns that you visited as a student. My family are in Walgett and Moree and Coonamble, and my elders used to tell us, we well remember what life was like before the Freedom Ride came through and then afterwards. So we honour and recognise that work and the work of Uncle Charlie Perkins. And this is such a fascinating subject, Paul Robeson. I thought before we start, hands up who knows a Paul Robeson song? Everybody.
Quite a few.
More than one. Do you remember the first time you heard that incredible voice? Yeah. Did it move you? It's memorable, right? Quite a presence. We might all know a little bit about Paul Robeson, but I guess there's much in your book that gives us a new perspective about him and his wife, Eslanda, and their tour of Australia in 1960. So I wonder why we should start maybe with why Paul Robeson and why now?
Well, why now? It's just that I finally got to finish the book. After I was saying, I really got the idea for it in about 2007, worked on it for a while, did other things and came back to it. So it's been a long process. So that's for now. But why the book? I think it really is it's interesting you mentioned the Freedom Ride because it really came out of my writing that book, doing the oral histories with former Freedom Riders, quite a number, but not everybody, but a number, mentioned having gone to a Paul Robeson concert in Sydney and that affected their thinking about racism, effectively racism and race relations. So that was partly in my mind. But I think the other side of it is that, like many communists of her age, my mother loved Paul Robeson records and songs. So I did grow up hearing those in not just the songs, but actually there's a quite disturbing record of the Peekskill riots, which were very against him and his ilk, if you like. I remember hearing that quite young. So I knew quite young that there was a sort of a conflicted history as well as this beautiful voice. So those things all came together eventually in a decision to write the book.
Tell us a bit about Eslanda, his wife, because she doesn't figure much in our imagining of him.
No, that's true. And at first, when I first thought of it, I wasn't thinking about her at all. But as I got into it, I realised when she was there all the time, and the cover actually shows it really well. She was the manager of the non-concert part of the tour, so of the political side of the tour. But then as I learned about her, her interest in Africa, in the UN, in China, and so on, I realised she was a really interesting person herself. So I decided that I wouldn't have her as too minor. She would be an important part of the book.
Tell us a bit about, her interests and you mentioned China and the UN.
Yeah, they were both in London in the late 20s and through the 1930s because of his fame really as a singer and an actor. And they both decided to get more education about Africa. And in a funny way, London was a funny place to do it, because here they were as African Americans, but being taught really by white British people about Africa. And they learned a lot of the anthropology, they learned a lot of languages. And she actually started a PhD, and she went to Africa in 1936. So that stayed with her for the rest of her life, and she went twice more. So she became quite an expert, actually, on Africa.
And they were both very active on race matters. And I'm struck when I'm reading the book of how modern their language seems to me, the way that they spoke, particularly about Aboriginal people when they got here. Might be jumping ahead a bit, but they were both very active, very aware.
Both in general, in world terms, in American terms, and in Australian and New Zealand terms here.
You mentioned that many of the freedom riders that you travelled with had heard Robeson, and had his music had affected them, had inspired them in some ways. What did they tell you was their lingering impressions of him?
It's interesting because the interviews weren't looking for that. You know what I mean? People kind of told about that story, although they were being asked about their childhood. And so the interviewing is, by the way, the interviews were done by my research assistant, Inara Walden, who was a terrific research assistant. So the comments are fairly brief, but they basically say that's where I started to think about questions of race, or something to that effect. So it was kind of a moment for people.
They come to Australia in 1960, but this tour has taken a very long time. There's been a lot of effort over a long period to bring them here. Could you talk a bit about that long history of trying to get them to Australia?
Well, the first attempts are in the 1930s, when he's at the height of his fame he's an actor in a whole lot of films. He's singing spirituals and other kinds of songs. He's acting, he's doing Othello, all of this. And so that you start to get in the Australian press, when is he coming here? When is he coming here? And there are talks going on, but in fact, the war intervened. It hasn't happened, and the war intervenes in 1939. So it all drops away. Then it revives in about 1950. And this is in the context of the onset of the Cold War, and which is, really severe in the US. I mean, he is now going from extremely famous and well-loved to cast out and suppressed because of his admiration, basically, for the Soviet Union. That's one dimension. And the other one is speaking out anywhere about racism and race relations in the US. So he is becoming a sort of persona non grata, but in the US, but he's still very much admired in many other parts of the world. And what happens is here, the peace movement here, which is getting going in 1950, wants to invite him to speak at a sort of, I think, the first major peace conference in 1950. And there's a lot of to and fro, and people hope he's come. But he actually loses his passport right as that conversation's happening. Well, the State Department in the US withdraws his passport. He cannot leave the country because of his political opinions. And in fact, she loses hers too, but it's his losing it that's the critical point. Okay, so that was going to be a political tour it wasn't a concert tour. And time passes. In 1958, they finally get their passports back and they go back to live in London again. And they're touring like mad because they've lost all this touring time. And also they've lost a lot of income. So they're very interested in tours that pay money. And they tour a lot in both Eastern and Western Europe in particular. And then two New Zealand entrepreneurs actually make an offer too good to refuse for them to come to New Zealand and Australia. And so they do.
So New Zealand was first on the tour.
Well, it took me a while to realise, but it's really one tour because they arrive in Australia first, in Sydney. The first concert is in Brisbane. And then they go to New Zealand and they do the 4 New Zealand cities, Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, Dunedin. And then they come back to Sydney and then Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth.
When they arrived in Australia first was in Darwin.
Well, there's a stopover in Darwin. I mean, one of the things I did when I did it, how did they get from London? What was it like to get from London to Sydney then in 1960 by plane? And it takes 2 days. It's about 8 stops and overnight stops, and it's quite incredible. But it's 1959 actually is when there was a big upgrade in plane transport. I mean, it was actually much quicker than it had been before that. So I think that partly probably influenced their decision to come, that it wasn't a week, it was 2 days. So one of the stops, was Darwin, and that's the first time they start talking to Australian people in Australia. Yeah,
and that's an interesting experience for them, right? Because it's their first encounter with the Australian media.
Well, actually, Darwin's fine that they just talk to a few locals, but then they come to Sydney, and that's where actually the media don't cover themselves in glory. But the Sydney interview at Sydney Airport, which happens, and they've had this incredibly long flight, and suddenly there's this major conference about 8:00 at night, I think, something like that. And that's an important part of the tour because I've listened to the recording. One of the journalists actually kept a recording of that tour. And what you hear on the recording doesn't match very well what you read in the print media. That is, the print version makes it out to be a very hostile, angry, him getting annoyed, stamping his foot. They ask him about communism and Hungary and a whole lot of issues going in the Cold War in 1960. But when you listen to it, most of it isn't like that at all. It's actually quite friendly and nice. There is a point where that happens, but it's a small part of the whole. So anyway, that sort of sets the whole tour off.
Is it possible he's lost his temper with these ridiculous questions?
Well, this is another thing. He keeps trying to talk about his music, and they keep asking him about the Soviet Union. It's actually, but when they write it up, it's often the other way around. Oh, Paul Robeson didn't want to talk about his music. He just wanted to talk politics. It's really quite amazing. Anyway, I've got quite a long description in the book. that event.
It's interesting. We were talking the other day, and it reminds me of so many other visiting artists, particularly people of colour who come to Australia, where they get the same reception from the Australian media, who ask awkward, cringy questions about race and politics, and they're often misquoted and misrepresented. There seems to be a
pattern.
Yeah, it's a pattern. That's right. That is a pattern. So after that press conference, they learned some lessons pretty quickly about how to deal with the media here.
Yeah, they tend to turn to more one-on-one interviews, and a lot of them are very good interviews, very friendly, very written up in quite some detail. They both emphasise that their grandparents, they have photos of their grandchildren. You can tell that they're trying to put a much warmer sort of image across and to sort of calm things down in a way because they want the concert tour to succeed, which in fact it does. And I mean, it's pretty much sold out in everywhere or packed out. So it does succeed, and that's actually very important to them and to their hosts. Yeah.
So can we talk a little bit about those hosts, because they were hosted in various cities by different groups or different arms of the same group?
Well, the peace councils in each city arrange events for people to meet them, talk to them, which are more openly political events. But it actually involves a lot more people than that. The biggest event of that kind is the one at Paddington Town Hall, which is jointly organised by the New South Wales Peace Council and the Aboriginal Australian Fellowship, which is basically Peace Bandler, very much important in organising that event. And they say there are 1,500 people there. And, they give speeches, they talk politics, he sings a bit. And this is the other thing. Around the country, he develops this thing. He'll sing a song, he'll talk about music, he'll talk about politics, he'll illustrate either a political point or a musical point by singing. And he moves between sort of speech and song sort of very easily and freely. And people love it. That's what they like to hear.
I wonder what he thought of that, because that wouldn't have been his usual. Was it his usual way of doing things?
I think he had developed a style of what I was just talking about actually was more the political side, but even in the concerts, which are more formal, a lot of the commentary emphasises how informal he is in the way he talks. And I call one chapter, the Adelaide chapter, a family party, because that actually is taken from him saying that's what he likes to create. And the commentators, the music critics and other people say it was like a family party. It was something informal, talkative. He makes a joke actually in Perth, which is the last concert, and it's the last concert of his last tour. It's quite a significant concert in a way. He says, my, what's he called? My managers, he doesn't mean Eslanda, he means his music managers. They keep telling me to stop talking so much and to do some more singing. But I love to talk. I love talking. And then he will sing something to illustrate some point. So
when he and Eslanda were travelling around, New Zealand as well, wanting to meet Maori people, but in Australia, they were very keen to meet Aboriginal people as well. How did that work out? And who did they meet, and how did that?
Well, in Brisbane, they met Margaret Vanadian, who was one of the first two people to graduate. Charles Perkins was the other one. And there's a photo of him and her on the front page of the Brisbane Courier. They meet some number of other people at various events. There's a garden party arranged for Eslanda, actually, and he meets several people there. There's also some post-concert events, quite late-night sort of events, and he meets people there. So Brisbane looks like he's going to be meeting people, and that's what they want. But it doesn't sustain terribly well around the country. He certainly meets people at the Paddington event and some other Aboriginal people, but not as many as he would have liked, I'm sure. And I don't think he learns as much about Aboriginal music as he would have liked. And I haven't been able to find any evidence that he met Aboriginal people in Melbourne or Adelaide, but he does again in Perth. And when he's welcomed at the Perth, there are quite a lot of Aboriginal people in the audience. So my reading of that is it really depends on some key people in each city who are connected both to the peace movement and the Aboriginal movement, and those key people enable that connection to be made. But it's not always there. Sometimes they're a bit too distinct for that to happen.
Again, it reminded me of later visiting artists who would have to make a point of going to look for and meet Aboriginal people. Like, they'd all want to come to the block. And, I remember Public Enemy came to Redfern, and it was just a hugely exciting moment. But they had to defy their record company to do it. Right, so
that's interesting. Just on that, Eslanda does go to La Perouse, and she meets people there. But Paul has got a concert that evening, and so he's not involved that day. But I couldn't find out much about that. I really, really tried. This is the classic historians thing. Some events you really want to know more, and you just can't find. But I know she went because, in fact, Faith Bander talks about it, and that's my main source on that.
Yeah, fascinating. He was hugely influential on particular Aboriginal singers and artists. So you mentioned Jimmy Little, Harold Blair, the opera singer.
Yep.
So he had an impact on people, even though they didn't get to see him.
Yes, no, I think that's right. And also commentators love to compare. If they wanted to praise an Aboriginal singer, they would say, "Oh, this might be the Australian Paul Robeson." That's quite common.
So while there weren't too many connections. They were keen to learn about Aboriginal people. They were shown a film or two. I think it was the Pindan people. Yeah, I thought was really, I was quite taken by that story. We don't want to give too much away because we want you to go and buy the book and read it. But can you talk a little bit about that episode?
Well, this is an event that happened, I think it's just before the Paddington Town Hall meeting. It's that morning. There's a film Faith Bander and some other people arranged this film screening for him. And one of them is what's often called the Warburton Rangers film, which is a film made in about 1957. It's about 3 years old. And it's made in the context of debates about bomb testing. And it's showing incredible poverty and distress amongst people in remote areas. And it was used by the Aboriginal movement in those 3 years, often to generate support for Aboriginal struggle, because it's sort of saying this situation is really dire. But the other film was a kind of pilot for a film that was never made, and it's kind of the other side of the story. So that's about the Pilbara strike and the Pilbara mob and so forth. So it's a sort of image of struggle and community, and so they get both. But it's really the one that shows the poverty and ill health and so forth that they're very shocked. And Paul Robeson throws down his beret and he says, I cried and so forth. So it's quite a moment, and it comes out in the Paddington meeting, and then the press pick it up, and that's partly how the press starts to really report what they think about the Aboriginal situation.
It's often a difficult tightrope that they walk around that, because they want people to come to a concert and not cause controversy, but they are obviously very moved by what they're learning.
That's right. No, that's right. And I think they managed that after this first thing in Sydney. They managed that pretty well, actually, to communicate with music critics and other kinds of journalists and people quite well. But they do let it be known that they think there are some problems in Australia.
He says, I'm coming back to help with the struggle, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. He says that many times. I'm coming back. Well, I don't know to jump forward in the story, but he never comes back. And, people are very upset. We don't regret that quite a lot.
I mean, as I said earlier, his language is remarkably progressive for the time. And he talks about the program, I think it was Spotlight. He talks about, he spoke about colonisation and how the white man came and took Australia from the Indigenous people, which for the time I thought was remarkably forward thinking and just referring to us in that way as Indigenous people, not using the terms that he would have.
That's right. I was really struck by that too. He says, I will say Indigenous. This is in 1960. I would have thought that would be more like 1985 or, that kind of distinction. Yeah.
And as a communist, he's got a very economic lens on things as well. He's talking about how there's no inequality by race. It's all about impoverishment. And if people are given enough opportunity, they can all be the same.
That's right. He's very strong in class. And I think this is where the Welsh connection comes in. He's very attached to the Welsh working class. He meets them when they're walking on a hunger strike in the 30s. Oh, not a hunger strike, but an unemployment sort of march in the 1930s, and they're singing. He loves their singing. He loves their voices, and he gets very attached to Wales, and that attachment goes both ways. And when he's in Australia, he often says, if I go anywhere in Wales, I could knock on any door and they would invite me in to have a cup of tea. And I think what he's doing with that partly, I think it's very genuine, but he's also stressing this is white working class, that it's not just race, it's also class, and that both of those things are really, really important.
And he was a hero to the Labor movement in Australia too. I mean, that was how he ended up at the Opera House.
Yes.
And he sang it into being, I think somebody says in your...
Yes, this lovely book, which I've just forgotten the name of it, but it's about how Robeson has been, it's quite a fairly recent book by an African-American scholar about how Robeson has been remembered. And she does talk about the Opera House, and she said he sang it into being. And I thought that was great. I thought that was just terrific.
And is a beautiful, and that footage comes up so often, in any sort of retrospective about the house or Sydney or, great moments in Australian history. There's always that footage of him singing for the workers.
Yeah. And I did find when I was doing this research, quite a lot of people now have not heard of Paul Robeson, particularly young people. And I'd say something and they'd say, oh, you mean the guy who was the first person to sing at the Opera House? That was the thing. That was the thing that they could, work out who I was talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, well, for my generation, it was my dad was insistent. He said, come and watch. That was Oklahoma, I think, where we sang Old Man River. And I was a kid and my dad dragged me into Showboat. Sorry, yes, it was, not Oklahoma. Yeah, it was definitely Showboat. And he dragged me in and said, watch this, and he was, he was a hero for people.
Yeah,
everyone was fine. You mentioned before that the Americans took away his passport, I think, for 8 years. There was a campaign to get it back under that McCarthyist era. Do you see parallels to today?
Yeah. What do you think?
I do. I mean, as a reader, I'm thinking, there was an active suppression.
Oh, I see.
He was pilloried and kind of sidelined, and they tried to silence him, and we see similar things playing out.
Absolutely. Yeah, the whole question of it's a freedom of speech kind of issue, which we're facing very strongly at the moment. It's interesting. I mean, there are a lot of parallels with today, but there are also a lot of differences as well, I suppose. One of the interests for me was trying to capture 1960 as a particular time that's kind of late Cold War in a way, although it's not by no means the end of it, but it's also early sort of civil rights, and capturing that sort of shift. And maybe this is one thing that struck me is how many people they met that I talk about in the book. I would just have a name and find out who these people were. How many of them were people who later became quite leading people in Australian cultural history, whether it was, at one point they go to a special performance of Arthur Miller's All My Sons at the New Theatre, and the audience is full of, you find out who the audience was, people who became leading figures in Australian drama, in ballet, and all sorts of things. So I didn't expect to find that, actually. Made me realise that there are a lot of people who had some kind of, who were opposed to the Communist Party at some stage, had left at some stage, or didn't leave perhaps, but often many left, and, went on to be really successful people in a cultural sense. Yeah.
Sounds like you're thinking about the next book there.
No.
I might close with this question then. In the book you describe the Robesons as figures of the future. What do you think you mean by that?
How modern some of their language and interests are. I mean, the whole talk about colonisation and decolonisation, questions of race, questions of, economics, real class, equality, inequality. They had a very kind of global view, and I think sometimes in the period between 1960 and now, a lot of politics got much more national in its focus, whereas they had a very international focus, even when they're very tied up in US, through the 50s, in US, struggles and stuff. They often see it in an international way. So to me, that's what we have to face as well, that our national, local concerns are part of a kind of global situation. So they didn't have the technology and so forth that we have, but they had the consciousness of that.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Anne Curthoys, would you join me in thanking Anne this evening?
History Lab.